Good afternoon all. Welcome to the Samvaad-Talk. The theme for this series is Education and Technology, Assessments and Evaluation. The title of today's talk is Scalable and Secure Architecture for Online Assessments and Evaluation. Today's speaker is our Professor Chandrashekar Ramanathan, currently the Dean of Academics here at IIITB. He joined IIITB in 2007 after spending over a decade in the IT industry. He received his PhD degree from Mississippi State University, USA. His current research focuses in the areas of data science and technology for education. Model-based software engineering and enterprise content management are his other areas of research interest. He serves on the technical advisory panels of many departments of Government of Karnataka, including the Department of Education, Finance, Center for Smart Governance. He also serves as a subject matter expert on the Board of Studies of Educational Institutions. Dr. Chandrashekar is a board member in the Board for IT Education Standards. He was recognized in the list of top 10 academicians in data science by the Analytics India magazine for the year 2018 and again for the year 2019. I welcome him on the behalf of IIITB research community. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So, welcome to this particular talk on a software system for conducting assessments and evaluation. And I'm glad that the sequencing of this particular talk is happening right after the talk of Professor N.J. Rao, who spoke about the pedagogical aspects of learning, and including he touched upon some of the things that I'm going to be taking for granted in some sense. And my talk will be focused primarily on the software aspects of assessments and evaluation. So it's not very linear. I will talk about some motivation and background about various things, about the various concepts that are relevant to assessments in education. And primarily it's going to be on higher education, and we'll talk about the software architecture, the modules. I'll briefly tell about the case study about an assessment activity that we had done for a Government of India organization and some future work. So, in my view, the biggest limitation or the constraint of the MOOC is manual assessments and evaluations. If you look at the one of the greatest challenges that we have in formal education, formal higher education in India especially, is that even now formal degrees are which are delivered completely in online mode are not recognized by the regulatory authorities, right? And among many of the reasons, one of the reasons is that especially when you talk about MOOC, and by definition MOOC has got lots of learners who are there, hundreds if not thousands of learners. So how do you conduct assessments in a manner that is truly reflective of the capability of the learner? Because that is one of the key expectations for the award of formal degrees, right? So that is why MOOCs have been confined more or less to learning experiences, learning activities, for even more so for self-learning, right? So we say that obviously if the goal of the learner is to learn something new, so there's nobody looking over my shoulder to say that did I do that, did I attend the classes, or did I watch the videos, did I take the exam? So in that kind of an environment, the MOOCs have been fairly successful, and they continue to be quite successful as well. But if you want to utilize the MOOC kind of a platform for more formal education, then we have to look well beyond the manual assessments and evaluation activities. Correct? So, which kind of leads to the need of large-scale online examinations, which is accessible to a much larger target audience, and and more so, it is just not the fact that you are able to conduct the examinations online, but if you do it well and do it in the way it can be evaluated automatically, then it can go a long way in improving the efficiency of our overall assessment process. But it's not that such assessments have not been there. Such assessments have been there, but they have been confined to predominantly multiple choice questions, as we all know, and they also lack a very sound pedagogical grounding in terms of how the assessment instrument was designed, why was this particular question asked and why not some other question, and what are the different alternative set of questions I could have asked in the place of this particular question. Those kind of deep thinking and conscious thought process is very difficult. I will not say it is not happening or impossible, but it is incredibly difficult to make that happen. Correct? So before I get into the architecture and so on, just to, you can almost think of this as a review of what we heard in the last session. So here we will be talking about assessments, and for all practical purpose, we can think of an assessment to be synonymous with an exam, at least in the context of what we are going to be talking about. And then, so we want to distinguish between assessments and evaluation. Assessment is just the fact, the act of conducting an exam. So, and then comes the evaluation part of it, which is typically assigning marks and grades to that particular assessment based on the responses given by the people who took that particular exam. So these are two separate activities, right? We also use the term called item and item bank, which again can be, that's a much more formal term to what we use as, what we call as questions and question bank in our normal usage. So items and item banks. Again, another very fancy name for a question paper is assessment instrument, because it turns out that question paper is an assessment instrument only if you're conducting an exam. On the other hand, if you are giving a paper writing activity, even that can be an assessment instrument as well. But in our context, again, we are going to be looking at it as a question paper. This is interesting. So response types to questions, in general, broadly we can think of as two types, the so-called selection type and the supply type. Selection type is where the person who is responding to a question selects from a given set of options, right? So the classic true false or the multiple choice questions, they are all examples of selection type questions. Whereas if you are expected to write something, then it is referred to as a supply type of response, wherein if I'm expected to draw, come up with a diagram, a flow chart or a program, or even write an essay, all these are referred to as supply type of responses, right? Finally, assessment pattern is something which governs the structure of my assessment, right? The structure of my assessment instrument, to be more specific, right? So none of these are new to you. The next one thing that which is a follow-on from the last session that we had, which we will be very heavily relating to, are these two things. One is the cognitive levels as proposed by the revised Bloom's taxonomy, right? So which talks about the 6 levels: remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. So the way I look at the Bloom's taxonomy is that any body of knowledge can be viewed from these 6 levels perspective, which means you take any body of knowledge, there are things that you have to remember, correct? So there are concepts that you have to understand, and then there are techniques that you should know how to apply, and then going beyond, right? So you should be able to analyze if there are multiple analyze a given solution in that particular context, and then we go on to the ability to evaluate when there are multiple solutions that are provided. You have to be able to judge and evaluate these multiple options. And finally, we talk about create, wherein you are actually contributing to that particular body of knowledge. Correct? So in terms of cognitive levels, so it is supposed to be increasing from top to bottom. So we say that create is the highest cognitive level, and remember is the lowest cognitive level. And there also have been studies which try to map, saying that so in what kind of education levels do these cognitive levels map to? So typically, it is understood that the remember, understand, and apply typically applies to undergraduate education, and analyze and evaluate kind of goes into masters, and create is really where the PhD kind of work kind of takes place in a given body of knowledge. Yeah. So that essentially is my view, saying that any body of knowledge, if you want to understand that body of, if you want to master that particular body of knowledge, then it will be useful to look at that particular body of knowledge along these 6 cognitive levels. On top of that, we also have these knowledge categories, which is another dimension, if you will, which is talking about the factual, and there are actually 6 or 7 other knowledge categories, but I have listed only 3: the factual knowledge, the conceptual knowledge, and the procedural knowledge. So what we are now saying is, now that is somehow some kind of an orthogonal dimension here, which means now we can think of that particular body of knowledge, which is essentially a cross product of the knowledge categories with the 6 cognitive levels. Yeah. Pyramid kind of. Correct. So what we are saying is, in terms of, as I said, so in the lower levels of cognitive levels, even when we talk about the progression of education as well, so as we go into higher and higher levels of learning, it also reflects the levels of learning that happens over a period of time. As I said, typically at an undergraduate level, studies have shown that the focus is primarily on remember, understand, and apply. But from a learner's perspective also, it is a pyramid that kind of, so we have the number of people who are doing a PhD level kind of a study is narrower and smaller and things like that. So there are multiple interpretations that you can also do. You can say that even the field, the knowledge, area of knowledge also becomes narrower, more focused, more deep, and so on. Correct? So now we can think of remember a level of knowledge which are typically factual in nature, but they can be conceptual in as well, or procedural. And so that's why you have this cross product that can be used. Okay? So that essentially is the background that is sufficient, because I will be using some of these terminologies while my talk will focus more on the architectures. So this is a software which is intended to do, help conduct assessments based on the principles that we just talked about. Essentially, so what is the general function, the functional flow, right? So we have the item bank generation, which is essentially we would want to create lots of assessment items. I'll go into the details of how do you go about doing it and what is it that the software helps you with. So once you have a large item bank, for example, we can engage lots of subject matter experts to create a large item bank. And assessment instrument generation is slightly decoupled from the item author itself. So here we are going to assume that the person who is creating the questions need not necessarily be the person who is creating the question paper. Right, so this is where the assessment pattern comes into the picture. So we can target depending upon my target audience, or depending upon we also talked about in the outcomes that we want to achieve. We can create different types of assessment patterns from which we can generate these assessment instruments. Okay, so that is essentially a kind of a background activity before the actual assessment takes place. correct? The actual assessment will take place in examination centers, wherein people will are presented that particular question paper, so they will actually write the exam. And once the assessment is over, the evaluation takes place, typically under the supervision of a controller of exams, and of course we have the MIS, the results being published, etc. Right? So this essentially is the functional flow that the OAES software caters to. Okay, so this is a bit of a busy slide. I'll quickly try to highlight some of the key modules of this particular software. So we have the item bank module, which allows the authors, any number of authors, to contribute items to the question bank. You can see that this particular item goes and sits in the question bank here, the item bank. And then, as we said, the assessment instrument generation is another activity which will take the inputs from the item bank, and it will make the assessment instrument available for the test delivery module. In parallel, so we have the student registration happening, and finally the examination interface is what is used for the student to write the exam, right? So you can see that the test delivery module will be distributing the question paper, and then the examination interface module, and finally the test evaluation will bring out the results of that particular assessment. So that essentially are the key functional modules of the online assessment and evaluation system that we are going to be talking about. So coming to the architecture principles, so there are, see, the way I look at architecture is, architecture is essentially a collection of principles, right? Which is instrumental in driving the design, right? Right, the classic architecture principles, we talk about separation of concerns, we talk about model view controller and stuff like that. They are all nothing but set of principles which says that, okay, so if I'm talking about a view, there should not be any actual data retrieval happening, that should focus only on the display and things like that. So keeping that kind of an approach in mind, so we came up with our own set of principles that this particular, the design of OAES has to adhere to. And one of the important principles that was included is that it will use non-centralized operations, okay? So non-centralized operations more specifically for the conduct of the assessment itself, okay? So in other words, what we are saying is, there is no central server which is going to run the exam, and then everybody is going to connect to the same server to write that particular exam. So obviously from a scalability perspective, that has got its own challenges. So right, for example, if you look at within IIITB, we have a separate server called an exam server, to which everybody who's taking the exam has to connect to that particular server, right? Whereas for this kind of a system, so we are saying a non-centralized approach is better, because primarily this is also one of the targeted at, as I will be talking about in the case study, it is targeted at a very large distributed kind of an assessment that is going to be conducted across multiple locations or across the country and so on. So this puts enormous amount of pressure in a centralized architecture. So at a very basic level, it was decided that it should support non-centralized operations, but of course there has to be centralized monitoring that has to be supported, right? So this was actually, in practice, it ended up being a bit of a challenge, but I'll briefly talk about how we overcame to support centralized monitoring where we have non-centralized operations. The other part is, which is kind of a side effect of non-centralized operations, is the fact that asynchronous data transfer. So there are, I will shortly show you the amount of data that flows through in this particular busy diagram that we saw. There's a lot of data that moves all around the place, and one of the things that we wanted to ensure incorporate as a principle was that all data transfers must be handled in an asynchronous manner, because in general, from an architecture perspective as well, asynchronous data transfers are non-blocking in nature, which also implies that there are more resilient to any faults that may occur in the process of the data transfer itself. And of course, the two non-negotiable, non-functional requirements are security and scalability. Okay. So let me talk about each of them. This is distributed, which is non-centralized, and the asynchronous part of it. So broadly, if you look at it, there are 4 modules that that this particular system has, right? So from the authoring module is the one that is responsible for creating the item banks, and we have the exam administration module, which is essentially will generate the question papers, the assessment instruments, and so on. And then the exam module is the one wherein students will, learners will log in and actually take the assessment. And finally, evaluation is the one that will do the grading. So if you can see, there are, we created lots of packs, what we call as packs for the asynchronous transfer of data, very loosely speaking. So if you look at the Q pack is comprised of the questions that are needed for creating a question paper, and the examination pack contains the question paper. It contains the student registration details, who are the students who have to take. All of that is coming from the examination administration module, because they will have the view of who are the people who are taking the exam and so on. So that is the E pack that is going on there. R pack is nothing but the student responses, right? So they have taken the exam. So what are all the responses that the students have given? So that is going as an input to the evaluation module. What you will also find is that the authoring module, a very conscious decision was to separate the questions from the answers themselves at a very fundamental level, right? So, for example, right, so the relationship between the question and the answer is maintained through surrogate keys, so that there is no visibility. So even if you get to look at the whole bunch of answer keys, it is very hard to figure out what is the question for which this is the answer key. And of course, questions can be a lot more sensitive than the answer pack, but the questions will contain only the questions, but it will not contain the answer pack. So obviously, from an evaluation module perspective, I need to know only the answer keys and the responses that are provided by the students, and I just need to compare the answer keys with the responses provided by the students. Right, so this essentially is the distributed and asynchronous. So what we mean by asynchronous is all this transmission of packets will happen asynchronously without any locking. So how exactly we are doing, when I show you the deployment architecture, that will become clear. Okay, so I think I talked about all these 4. The security aspect of it. So as we know, one of the biggest risk is coming from activities that happen on the internet. So we said that at a very fundamental level, there shall not be any use of HTTP, HTTPS on the internet. So in this particular case, we said that it is a strictly intranet only kind of a, so whatever web applications we are developing, it should not depend on access through internet. So which is essentially the HTTPS over the intranet, and which means that at least I have taken out from the equation this the malware or any cyber attacks that can happen over the internet. The second aspect is now we are talking about the packet transfer of data packets and so on. So there what will happen is all the packet transfer happens. It does require internet. Why it requires internet, I will tell you in a minute. But it happens over the secure FTP protocol only, and so all those packets are digitally signed, OTP enabled with for two-factor protection of that particular packet, and of course, purely as I already mentioned, the question and answer never travel together ever. So this is again from a security point of view. These are some of the principles and the approaches that we took. lastly, from a scalability perspective, so now probably the larger, in fact, let me spend time looking at this, then the scalability part will become clear, right? So this is what I said. So we said that the intranet zone is where all the quote unquote the backend activities happen. So we have the item bank management, the question paper management, the online evaluation, the test administration, everything happening within the intranet zone. So there is, which means all the data, everything remains within this particular zone. So I can make it as secure as I want by following standard security practices with respect to my IT infrastructure. So what is going to happen is when we get to the, look at the examination center wise, so what we are saying is even within the center, all the people who are taking the exam are also sitting inside the intranet zone, their own LAN. Right? So which is slightly different from our other online examinations where everybody connects to some central server which is located somewhere else. So here we are saying it is all, there is a local server associated with each of those centers, right? So then what we are left with is how do I securely transmit those packets back and forth between this zone and this zone. So after a lot of discussion and evaluation and stuff like that, so we came up with this particular option. So wherein one particular server is placed on the internet, but it will not accept any other protocols other than the FTP protocol, secure FTP protocol, and which is again, so where all the necessary, yeah. Why not deploy a VPN? True. Correct. So the moment we go into the VPN, we are almost going towards that centralized kind of an approach, wherein. So the VPN management will. True. Your exam management can. Yeah, we could have looked at it. We could have looked at it, but when I come to the specific case study, also we are looking at a centralized organization having lots of franchisees. So their own centers are there and then their own franchisees are there. So there was some hesitation in bringing the franchisees also onto the same intranet VPN. So they wanted them outside, they didn't want them anywhere near. So. All right, so that, yeah. So from now if you see from a scalability perspective, each center has got its own local server and the machines connected to the local server over LAN. And another advantage here is there is no need to run a multi-center exams using a central clock, okay, which provides a lot of resilience and reduces enormous amount of tension, saying that okay, in some in specific use case we are talking about is exams being conducted in over 40 centers and 40 centers of their own and then multiple franchisees and so on. So somebody will call from somewhere saying that no, we are having a problem, we are not able to start the exam and so on, then I have to hold everybody. And so that essentially was is something that we wanted to avoid, which is essentially the central clock. There is no central clock and which all the exams have to synchronize to. Okay, so I will jump on to the functional aspects of it quickly. So we have the authoring module. As part of the authoring module, we have item authoring, which is giving inputs into the item bank, and then the assessment pattern generator, which helps you create assessment patterns. I think I have some screenshots. I'll show it to you, and eventually the assessment instrument generator and the pack exporters. So all these things are part of the authoring module. The assessment module is essentially, right, so if I want to conduct the assessment, I need to be able to import the list of students, the question paper, the assessment and so on. So that is the EPAC that contains all of this information. So the assessment module is running in the individual centers. Right? So from a scalability perspective, now we can easily see that I can keep adding on any number of centers that I want without putting a central load on any single node in terms of the number of people who are taking the exam and things like that. So this becomes very naturally scalable. In some sense, in architecture parlance, this is horizontal scalability, right? So I'm able to scale horizontally by adding any number of centers that I want, right? So this, so from the assessment perspective, so what are the tasks? So I need to import my question paper, and I have to conduct the exam. So which means I have to put it up, I have to manage the time. So the exam is for 90 minutes. So I need to have a local clock that is running, which is keeping track of that, and a lot of additional requirements in terms of local authentication. How do you do the authentication, and how do you have exceptions, etc., etc. All of that is built into that. And eventually, what we get out of this are the responses from the people who are writing the exam, which gets exported in the form of a RPAC into that central FTP server. This is just the admin module, which will help you create the assessment instruments, which will help manage the candidates, the people who need to authenticate at the different centers, and monitoring of the exams, and all these typical admin modules. And this is the actual correction, the grading module, which contains wherein I will import the responses received from the people who are taking the exam, and then I will import the keys corresponding to the question of that particular question paper that was asked, and I'll do the evaluation and generate the marks list, right? So which again can be exported. So this is another view from an exam management perspective. I can manage exams, managing exam centers, managing candidates, and whole bunch of import activities. And you can also see that this is the remote monitoring also that I was telling you, that decentralized operations and centralized monitoring. So the centralized monitoring is included as part of the examination administration module. So which means everything that is happening with respect to the centers gets logged at. So in fact, even there, instead of directly, because all those individual centers are sitting inside their LAN, I cannot even know what is going on there. So even for that, a common audit log was placed inside that FTP server, wherein the centers will keep pushing back what is going on in each of those centers. So they'll keep logging events saying that exam has started, this many people have logged in, this many people have completed the exam. So all these logs are centrally pushed into that same server. And since that server is accessible to my admin module, again, the advantage of decoupling, so there is, I can monitor those individual centers. All right, so quickly, a bit of a deep dive on the concept map for an item. So what is a question, so to speak, right? So you can see that there are two parts to that particular. One is the assessment item and the assessment pattern, right? So when we talk about the assessment items, it is tagged with a lot of metadata. Metadata including what is the topic on which this particular item belongs to, what is the subject, what is the cognitive level, what is the difficulty level, what is the item type. I'll talk a little bit more about item types shortly, right? So all these tags, including knowledge category, that is not shown here, knowledge category. So a lot of metadata is taken and mapped. So all of that becomes very, very useful for me to generate my assessment pattern now. Now I can create assessment pattern using, based on topics, different cognitive levels, different difficulty levels, different knowledge categories, different item types. So I can create the pattern. So obviously you can imagine it's going to be a very painful process, but I do it once. So this is essentially, so this is where you have to relate it back to the way how should assessments be done, which is, for example, if you are following, say, the outcome-based the methodologies, right? So in terms of the outcomes, and there could be different levels of attainments that you are targeting, saying that for this particular outcome, this is the amount of weightage. So you can specify that for this particular topic, because this is important from an outcome perspective, I am assigning more weightage to it. So I can, so as a person who is designing, obviously this requires very deep knowledge and interest in trying to understand what constitutes a good examination. Okay, so this is where the OAES system goes much beyond what say a Moodle can do today.
Basically targeted at median feedback from the users as to what their cognitive level is currently, and then
correct,
creating an assessment that's not part of it.
Correct. See, absolutely. See, no. See, again, this is what the software can do, right? So now what we are saying is, we have to have a much deeper discussion on saying how do you even tag these questions at what cognitive level and so on. In fact, a lot of interesting papers have came out of this particular work. In fact, so this project was done with Professor N.J. Rao, and Shilpi was my PhD student who completely worked on this one. So we had a very interesting paper even on saying that how do you even judge the difficulty level of a question, correct? So if you look at the difficulty level, the traditional difficulty level mechanisms have been on looking on historical data. If a lot of people are unable to answer the question, then it is more difficult, otherwise it is not. What we came up with as part of her thesis was how do you make it the learner independent, how do you make it even the evaluator independent as well, right? So you can, so then based on essentially what our hypothesis was that it is difficulty level in particular was is a function of three things, right? So one is the content itself, right? So what kind of a content are we talking about? You know, we talked about the 6 levels. So within that, where does it, what body of knowledge is it addressing, right? So there's the next is what is the stimulation for the response itself that we are expecting? Does it require lots of calculations? Does it require a lot of assumptions to be made, or is it all straightforward? I just apply it, right? So there are multiple aspects based on which we can arrive at the difficulty level. Yes. Yes.
So you can dynamically take it from the question paper.
Yes.
The instrument itself is not static.
No, it is not. Precisely. That is why we are saying assessment pattern is what is static. I will create. So this is where having a very large, assume I have a large item bank with all this tagged in. Then I'll put an assessment pattern saying that these are the topics that I want, these are the cognitive levels I want, these are the knowledge categories, all that I'll put in, and then I press a button, assessment instrument gets generated. That's exactly how it is implemented. Items have to be created manually. Correct. No, the person who is adding the item has to tag it manually. It has to be manual. So which is where we expect subject matter experts to again when I come to the case study, I'll tell you how we went about doing that, but it is manual.
Create multiple papers. Is there an intelligent monitoring which is made so that we ensure that the best paper for the situation is considered multiple papers?
I don't know what constitutes the best paper. No? I'm saying as long as it is compliant with the pattern that I have given, I think we have to go with it. So at least that is the way we have viewed it. For example, what we don't look into is as you also mentioned, my current abilities of it is learner independent in the way it is done. So I don't even look at the cohort of people who are taking that assessment. So, you know, these are all smart kids. Let me create a more difficult, quote unquote, difficult paper. Otherwise, so that is not the spirit here, right? Because you should remember, so this kind of an assessment is within the larger framework of outcome-based education. So wherein you don't want to judge people in terms of who is better than who is not. You just want to look at the people who are the people who have attained the outcomes that I am expecting out of this particular learning exercise.
Normally, student level can be
Correct. Understood. Correct.
So normally, do you have even topic level is
not at this level, so we have not considered that, but see there are two challenges there. Even if I put that, So one of the things, as I said, the whole concept here has been that not to, we are assuming we don't have inputs on the student's information, correct? So which is why, I agree that in order to make it more complete, that input also should be factored in when figuring out the difficulty levels and so on. So the difficulty level metric right now is predominantly based on learner independent attributes, based on the static characteristics of the question that is being answered. That's the correct. And then what we also did was, now the real challenge came, right? Now we said, okay, all these are great things to have. So how do you remember one big issue is selection type versus supply type, okay? So it was, unfortunately, the multiple choice itself got a bad name because the way the multiple choice questions were framed was bad. It is not that the multiple choice question as an item type itself was bad, okay? So which is where what we did was, we studied this particular, the work, the subjects for which we had to create the items and so on. So if we had to create questions at different cognitive levels and so on, it turned out that merely relying on selection type was good enough, right? Selection type in its primitive form as a multiple choice was good enough for remember and probably some amount of understand type of questions. So what we did was we put together about 18 different question types, which is a mixture of, in fact, what I should have done is I should have tagged it with selection versus supply type, but effectively, which is a mixture of which can take responses which are both selection type and supply type, right? For example, the first 4 are your standard selection type kind of a questions, multiple choice, true, false, fill in the blanks, and so on. And pardon the terminology called short answer. Short answer is not what you think as short answer. It is not textual answer. Short answer is what we generally call as, there is a typical, say, reading comprehension kind of a question, and then there are a lot of sub questions that are there. That is what they call as short answer. And so like that, there are many question types. So one thing I want to tell is, so what we did was, in terms of our evaluation, now we were looking at the difficulty of evaluation. Because if the objective was only to conduct assessments and be done with it, then these are all very easy. I could have created those question types, expected the students to type the answers and then walk away, right? But then objective is automated evaluation. So I had to do some kind of a reverse engineering to figure out what are the question types that are easy to evaluate automatically. Then when I look back, right, so multiple choice is easy to evaluate, true false is easy to evaluate, match the following is easy to evaluate. Then what we did was we looked at all these other question types and we retrofitted these techniques for doing that particular. For example, you take okay, reordering the sequence, yeah, is one such thing, right? Suppose I expect the students to write the steps to carry out certain tasks, which is a supply type of a question. So what we did was of course, so it is a slight compromise. So if it is a 100% supply type of a question, they stare at a blank sheet and then they are expected to remember what those 6 steps are and then they are supposed to write. We said, okay, so we probably cannot do that. So we did a little compromise and then said that, okay, I will give you, say, 8 steps, of which only 6 are relevant. Then I give them the ability to sequence it, move it up and down. Right? So that is one example of where I am using a simple selection kind of a technique, but actually able to ask a supply type of a question. So we did a lot of jugaad in that sense. Another very interesting was number 14 and 15. Complete the block diagram questions and flowchart questions and so on. We said that, okay, obviously now I cannot make them draw. So we could do a lot of things. We could create questions by leaving out the labels within the boxes and say what goes inside that particular label. Or in fact, in some cases, we even remove the arrows so that and ask them to put the arrows in the right direction. So I have lots of screenshots in the backup slides. Please feel free to look at it, but I'll quickly tell you. So what did we say? You take a flow chart. So within the flow chart, if right, so there is a, we give the answer is this is the arrow that matters, or this is the symbol that matters. This is the symbol that has to be used, right? So this is the symbol that has to be used. Okay, so we same thing happens with labels as well. We'll remove labels from flow charts. We'll remove, right? In block diagrams, we remove those labels. We remove certain blocks. We'll ask what block is missing, etc., etc. Right? So like that, for many of them, we had to come up with inventive ways of using the existing question types, standard question types. Having said that, we also did a few which is again standard today, like programming questions, which is again, you ask the question, you ask them to write a program. There also we created lots of variations. Incomplete programs, we give lots of the entire program, and then we'll blank out certain lines, very important lines, and slip in a small text box there. We ask them to type in the missing code. So like that, we had to do lot of different kind of ideas to make sure that we are able to accommodate as many supply type questions as possible. I'll talk about one last thing wherein which was not integrated here, but we integrated it into Moodle, for example, right? So in Moodle, of course, all the programming type of questions can be integrated. For example, SQL type of questions. Even now I use it, so we ask them to write SQL queries. System will evaluate automatically and so on. But one other interesting thing that we did was, yes, that's a standard way in which everything is done. But this was interesting. So what we did was UML. The ability to draw UML diagrams was important. So within UML diagram, you have class diagrams, right? So class diagrams typically, right? So they have all of these symbols and, right? So they are supposed to draw this, and this is composition, and then you say this is inheritance and so on. This is a class diagram. Okay, so for this one, what it did was, here we attempted, the user has to draw. So they will use a UML drawing tool. So there are many BOUML, that kind of a drawing tool is there. They'll draw the tool. So, and then all of these things, they give me the ability to export that particular model in the form of an XML file. So I take that particular XML file, and then the teacher draws this particular same picture, I mean corresponding to that particular question. I will have the teacher export their UML file, XML file, then I will have an intelligent comparison of that XML file. For example, we came up with a rubric saying that all the classes that the teacher is having, the student should also be having. They may be having more classes, but that's okay. All the relationships, the association, I'll count the number of inheritance, and so on. So we do that, some kind of a heuristic comparison between these two, and then come up with an evaluation. So these are different ways, but obviously we have a very long way to go to do full-fledged supply type, right? I don't know, so evaluating the images and stuff like that, so that was not done. Just a glimpse of the metadata there. So item type, item subject, competency, unit of study, cognitive level, knowledge category, difficulty level, and even keywords. You can also put in your keywords as part of your item bank, and add items to your, this is all manual. And of course, so what, okay, the screenshot that I didn't include here, which is there in the backup, is that now you can imagine I'll get an assessment pattern screen, not the assessment instrument screen. I'll create an assessment pattern screen, which will say, what is the topic I want, what is the weight I want to give, what is the weight I want to give to remember type of questions, what is the weight I want to give to conceptual questions in the knowledge category. So I can create a complete matrix of different combinations of, you'll see that that screen is really, really busy, but then we expect that it is a one-time activity, and if you have an item bank which is large enough, then it can last for quite some time. There are 6 cognitive levels, yes. No. So that's it. I showed you in the initial screen, right? There are only 6 cognitive levels and then 3 knowledge categories that we are talking about. Yeah, sure. It can. Sure. I mean, it requires, we need to think about it, but yes. But right now it is all manual, okay? So quickly, let me talk about where it was, where it all started. So this was, there's a national skill development program, wherein they have 40 different learning centers. There are over 8 lakh learners. They run about 75 courses, and over and above these 40 learning centers, they have these independent franchisees also who can be part of this particular learning network. So here so all these learning, they're all learning centers, but the certification is controlled centrally by this particular organization. So what we did was we specifically took one particular program on skill development course in information technology. So which had these subjects, IT tools, internet technology, programming and problem solving through C, application of .NET, introduction to multimedia, and so on. And about 1,000 items is what we were supposed to generate for each of those subjects. And these are all the software modules that we were expected to deliver for them. So the software was delivered, the item bank of containing about, this is just the matrix of the number of item banks. We created about 7,300 items as part of this. This was a huge, very, very difficult exercise. Actually, if you look at the effort spent, more than the software itself, a lot of effort was spent here because this is completely manual. So we had to conduct lots and lots of workshops. In fact, I should not say we, Professor N.J. Rao had to conduct lots and lots of workshops explaining to them, I mean, understanding 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions is good enough. Then now we are talking about creating an assessment instrument in 5 dimensions. Then, right, so it was a interesting exercise, so to speak, at the least. And we managed to deliver. So we engaged the services of teachers in various colleges as part of the college teachers training. So we used to train them on how to generate those assessments, and then we had our own team which would go through that to look for any errors and stuff like that. So that part was delivered. The item bank was delivered. Independent security testing and certification was also done using a certain empaneled vendor, and we also volunteered to do a pilot in one of those 40 centers where this was actually deployed and done. Incidentally, even before doing that, I had run my own couple of exams at IIITB as well. So it looked okay, at least, right? So obviously this is more can be done, right? As we are seeing, there are a lot of areas where, as I briefly mentioned, a lot more can be done in adding more supply type of questions, drawing type, and definitely in a lot of need for essay type kind of assessments are becoming important. A lot of research is also happening, and I personally have not looked at the state of the art, but to the best of my knowledge, it is still happening, I suppose, right? It's still not there yet. The other one, right, which is not just from an assessment perspective, this lab type of activities, if you want to do, right, which requires you to do activities in the lab type of thing, I don't know, right? I don't know how you can do a chemistry lab experiment without smelling the hydrogen sulfide. Okay, so I don't know, right? So a lot needs to be done. In fact, on this note, there was an attempt as part of the virtual labs initiative of the Government of India as National Mission on Education Information using Information and Communication Technologies, NMEICT. So they did fund a lot of research projects on creating these virtual labs, wherein the physical labs can be manipulated remotely. In fact, I think our Professor Prasanna had a lab which you could control a lathe which is sitting in the Siemens lab over the internet, sitting somewhere else. Okay, so but again, really in prototype level and things like that, I don't know where we are, how close we are to actually starting using it. I don't know, more security features maybe. We did not really put it through, of course it went through third-party certification and so on, but still we can never be sure about security, so there's always more we can do about security. The other aspect of it is, in terms of assessment, this is more useful for summative assessment, which means, see, the fundamental difference between formative assessment and summative assessment is that formative assessment has got a feedback loop, right? So at this time, we don't have any feedback mechanism on your assessments. It just says your answer is correct, your answer is wrong. So because by design it is intended for summative assessment, but I think that is one missing piece which if it were present, it could be used for more personalized learning, adaptive learning, intelligent tutoring. Many of those mechanisms require this kind of a feedback loop, which is not present in in this particular architecture. And of course, we have to talk about machine learning and AI, and as you rightly said, we can, considering the amount of data that will be available based on the students' performance, as well as the amount of metadata that we are collecting with respect to the assessment instruments, I'm sure if we think about it, a lot more can be done to make it, even just to improve. You were talking about different levels of types of question paper, how can it be made better? So we can come up with some metrics saying that why one question paper is better than some other question paper, perhaps. That's exactly 3 p.m. and I'm glad I managed to stick to my time. Any questions, please? Yes, Sina.
So, I think
True.
Not like you must recall only after.
Absolutely.
The thing is, if someone is not, if someone was able to recall correctly, then they should have also done some kind of I remember, I'll give a concrete example. I remember one university where I was and they were asking questions like what is the context-free grammar and microphone are used? What is this? What kind of, I don't know what, even I don't know whether I know what is a context-free grammar, I can create something, and, but the idea is that the textbook says CFD,
Yeah.
whatever. Right? And they're looking only at that. Right? They're not understanding why, what is a context-free grammar, why. But there's also this other usual saying that comes in teaching during the colonial time. The British were asked, were told to learn that when they came back from a party or something and they wanted the chowkidar to open the door, they were asked to remember and say, there was a cold day. There was a cold day. So the chowkidar heard there was a cold day and he opened the door. So there was I had no idea why they should get this. Or,
sure.
So the thing is, it becomes just the recall that
True. Yeah, I understand. So there are again multiple schools of thought that are there as to, because I think the key challenge here is how do you characterize knowledge itself, right? So what constitutes knowledge? And I don't know. So we can. It is arguable that this is one way of looking at it, and I definitely agree that there could be some dimensions which are missing altogether as well. And I don't think, maybe my diagram was misleading, but I don't think it was even projected as being hierarchical in that sense. In the sense that probably, I would imagine, again, I have not maybe looked into the literature, so maybe somebody can be at a higher, quote unquote, higher cognitive level without being very conversant with the lower, without remembering everything. So maybe that's quite possible. Sure. Okay. Yes, please. Sika. Yeah. We can configure that. Yeah. Exactly. Hopefully, the pattern will take care of that. Correct. Exactly. True. I don't know. So we have to do analytics. No, correct. So when we ran this thing, we didn't do that kind of an analysis subsequently. Again, we didn't validate the hypothesis that it will be identical, it will be similar. I think, Srinath, you want to take on that?
So one of the things that you were arguing as part of the group was we created our own empowerment hierarchy. So one of the biggest feedback we got was how is it different from the system?
Okay.
So
impressive, not perfect, but you are able to measure. For example, I may remember several things, but I understand the smaller subgroup, and then the amount for even for a person, that's going to become smaller and smaller. That's kind of the.
Yeah. Yes.
Objective automation, objective answers automation, like multiple choice, what was been done, or more accurate, or wrong subjective answers.
Subjective answers, you mean?
Yeah. So
yeah.
How much accuracy?
Correct. Yeah. So, correct. So I think, which is exactly what I was trying to tell you. So subjective essentially is essay type kind of evaluation. I have not looked into the state of the art, but it is still not very reliable, and it has not been widely used. But a lot of research, active research is still happening, especially with the newer advances in natural language processing and so on. With some people are even looking at how do you look at IBM's Watson, for example, which is essentially projected as a question answer, right? So that is that one that quiz, right? So now they are trying to say that can we use something like that to not look at the syntactic aspects of it, but try to get deeper into semantics and things like that. So we are not there yet. Yeah, it's still a question mark. But what our learning was that there's a lot of other supply type of questions we can ask other than essay type, textual. That is, I think that itself was, very good for us, because when we did an analysis, we did a big study of all their past question papers, and it was so horrible in terms of the spread across the topics. It was all concentrated at one level. It was concentrated to lower one specific type knowledge category, one specific level. So we are not able to. We could see that the kind of supply type questions that we are asking, write short notes on the scheduler in an operating system. That is the kind of questions we were seeing, right? Whereas using slightly better approaches, we could ask better questions to judge their understanding of operating systems.
That can be automated.
Correct, exactly. I'm saying, so in my view, I think we probably have to give up on that essay until we have a very...
With the literature, art subject, or the science subject like math and physics. So automation will be easier in science than the art.
true. I think that's why we are primarily looking at higher education, that too engineering, higher education and so on.
So
Yeah.
I'm just looking forward when my paper can be automated.
Yeah, please. Yes, please.
5 years, difficult to say.
No, no. See, I mean, again, we can definitely, I can have a separate presentation for the faculty members also to see how we can exploit even these existing types to ask that kind of questions. No? So, you have the network diagram, so we can project it as a block diagram kind of a question and then try to come up with creative questions.
The reformatting of questions, right?
Yes.
The creative way of
Yeah.
questioning. So, won't it change the cognitive level of the question? I mean, as in, if you were to just ask an essay type of question, which is probably recall, now you're probably making it.
No, how can there itself there is a mismatch. So essay type and recall, they don't go hand in hand at all, straight away, right? So which is why this is a much better reflection of because even if you look at the past question papers, we studied about 10 years of question paper. It was very difficult to even gauge what is it that they are trying to assess, right? So. Yeah, so the connection would come basically, it depends upon how much you have internalized this whole outcome based and stuff like that, right? So you talk about, suppose you have the outcomes, then the instructions have to be mapped directly with respect to the outcomes. So if your assessments are also linked, so you are to the same set of outcomes, then there is a in fact, that ended up being one of the practical challenges. If you look at my status, it stops at pilot. Because in practice, in practical terms, so they had these 40 centers all around the country, 40 plus another 20, 30 instructions. They had no idea how the instruction was happening in all those places, right? So now there's a lot of pushback from those centers saying that no, you cannot suddenly come and impose something like this, which is probably in hindsight we should not have done. In hindsight, we should have fixed the instruction part of it and then gone on to the assessment aspects of it. Yeah, so we kind of said that we'll show the value of doing it this way because the idea was to make it attractive for the central administrators to say that if you do that, your examinations can be uniform, they will all, their results will be comparable and so on. And which we probably successfully managed to sell that particular value proposition there, right? But you are right that it has to be in sync with the instruction mechanism, otherwise this will not work. Yes. Yeah. Yes, please.
Loss in creativity.
Yeah. Will it lead to a loss in creativity or creative assessments? Yes, maybe. Quite possible. Unless we add the other things that I talked about, right? So which is where when you address some of these things, we can bring in creative aspects of it. So which again, to a small extent, we did succeed. So for we have been able to automate class diagram assessments, sequence diagram assessments in UML and things like that. So wherein nothing is given, they just draw. But of course, since I am again comparing it with the instructor's thing, which is also bad, I'm saying don't be too creative. No, toe my line is what I'm asking. But still, it is better than nothing. Thank you.